Take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
So Hasan Piker went on Theo Von's podcast. Theo Von's podcast is called, I don't remember what it's called, but I'll put the episode up. And Theo Von has been doing a lot of interesting interviews lately. There's something interesting about him because he's wading into the political world. He has some pretty right-leaning political views. I think that was kind of his default when I first started hearing about him doing interviews and opining on politics. It was usually from a right-wing angle. And he's continued doing so. I believe he interviewed J.D. Vance. He's interviewed Bernie Sanders. He might have even interviewed Trump. I think he did. So a variety of political figures, definitely leaning right. His politics still seem to lean right. But there's something that has shifted where he's kind of gone in this more like populist direction. You know, the opinions of a guy like Bernie Sanders seem to appeal to him. Even being willing to have Hasan Piker on his podcast or being aware of Hasan Piker, I think says a lot about where he stands, because Hasan's career is in an interesting place as well, and I'll get to that later. But he's incredibly popular, but he's also fairly marginalized as a figure. He doesn't get a ton of time in the sun. A little bit after the election, he was doing some interviews. I believe he was on CNN for some interview with somebody, and he did interviews with, like, I think Pod Save America. So in the aftermath of the election, there was definitely some curiosity about his perspective, being that he's a guy who has a huge audience of young people, left-leaning young people. A lot of those people did not turn out to vote for Kamala Harris. A lot of them did, but there were a lot of people that went for Jill Stein instead, and that sort of thing, and just turnout in general was down. And that's if you discount the claims of voter suppression, which voter suppression definitely happened. But if we just look at the straightforward numbers of the turnout of the election, a lot of the younger left-leaning audience was not the one turning up in force. And so I think that leads people to look at a guy like Hasan as a net negative. People who are in the beltway of politics, or who look at young people as a sort of group of cats to be herded to the ballot box, Pokemon Go to the polls, etc. And so a guy like Hasan, I think, is perplexing for people who think that way, because he has this enormous audience, and he also advocates for people to vote for Kamala Harris. Pretty sure that he advocated for that. And so, I think people see him as a gateway to some of this younger or more left-leaning audience in terms of how they think and how they're landing in the places they're landing on these issues. And by the way, I don't think that a significant portion of Hasan's audience went and voted for Jill Stein. I don't think that there's that much overlap there. But I think for people from a distance, even if you're just like in the Democratic Party or you're kind of a standard liberal, you look at somebody like Hasan as the liaison for that type of politics, that sort of brand of left-wing politics, anything from Bernie Sanders to Jill Stein, etc. So, and then you have Theo Von, who is kind of the same thing for this vaguely right-wing audience. And it seems like Theo Von's audience is, slightly different from Joe Rogan's. I'm sure there's a ton of overlap, because Theo Von is one of the guys who benefited a lot from the enormous platform that Joe Rogan built. And he essentially had such huge numbers on his platform that if you had somebody on a couple times, they would become widely recognized within the comedy world, especially comedians, but really anybody. I mean, crackpot, fake intellectuals, actual scientists, disgraced scientists. All of these kinds of people have gained a ton of prominence just by appearing on the Joe Rogan Experience. And so, not to take away from Theo Von's comedy, I think he's a funny comic, not particularly my speed, but I think he's earned his keep. And that's why, up until relatively recently, he wasn't a super political guy. I mean, his shtick was more like, yeah, dude, yeah, I used to know somebody who used to sleep in the creek. Just like he was a goofball, and he would make up stories, and that, I think, is how he found a wide audience of people that are kind of on the more southern edge, or people who are into Joe Rogan, and people who are into this sort of supposedly in the middle brand of politics, which I think is going to become an increasingly strong brand for one reason, which is that the Republicans are incredibly repulsive. But there are a lot of right-leaning people who are going to increasingly not want to identify themselves with the Republican Party, but they also don't want to identify themselves as Democrats. But fundamentally, though, they lean to the right. These are not like real centrists. And I think that that's a big part of the dynamic shift that we see, or just the dynamic in America currently in general, is that, what we consider to be the middle is really right-leaning. So everybody who preens about there's not enough politicians, there's not enough podcasts, there's no political party that caters to the middle and the center, I just don't think that's true at all. And I think, if anything, we just need a reorientation of what we consider the center to be. Because as we pull further right, and ideas like universal healthcare become increasingly radical in the eyes of Americans, then we're just not going to have any ability to create a sensible politic. Because if our idea of centrism is compromising with the most extreme portions of the right wing and not compromising with anything left of liberal at all, that's not real centrism. That's a right wing coalition. So that's pretty much all that's on the menu in America at the moment. And that's why I think it's interesting for a guy like Theo Von to be talking to Hasan, because it shows some genuine curiosity on his part. All of these interviews show some real curiosity. The fact that he wants to talk to Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and Hasan Piker. He had Candace Owens on his podcast the previous day, which I haven't even watched any of that. I can't stand listening to Candace Owens, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't think there are many commentators who are less honest than Candace Owens is. But I think Theo seems to, so clearly there's a concern about his discernment there. But that also seems to have opened the door for him to talk to a guy like Hasan Piker, who not only is decisively on the left, but he is not some kind of mainstream politician or somebody running for office. He is just a guy with a big audience who spreads his ideas and a sort of left-wing ethic regularly. And so Theo Von wanted to expose his audience to Hasan's ideas. And so my question is, I don't really know where Theo Von is wanting to land with all of this. I appreciate his political curiosity. I appreciate him being open to talking to different types of people. And I do think, the sort of phony centrist narrative aside, I do think that there's a lack of, or there could be more people who are just earnestly unsure about politics, and they're entertaining, different versions of it. The problem with that is that any direction you go, you are going to increasingly be given reasons why you should completely shut the door on the other side. Or not even the other side. I mean, even the further you wade into left-wing politics, specifically, the more divisions become clear between these different entities, and the more people are going to tell you that you can't platform this person because of such and such, and you can't believe this and this at the same time, etc. And I think that even is happening a little bit with this Hasan Piker episode on Theo Von, because you have Ethan Klein, who I don't believe is any type of leftist. He kind of tried to play that game for a little bit with Hasan, but he couldn't hack it, because I think what he found is that his morals and ethics just do not align with leftism or democratic socialism or anything in that realm at all, which has caused him to take this combative stance against Hasan. So Ethan has sent a bunch of his, he told people to basically show up in the comments of this video talking about how radical and extreme Hasan is. Ethan is on like a mission to get Hasan canceled, essentially. So, I mean, that's the perfect example of like, you have to not just be curious, but you have to be really stubborn in your curiosity in order to really freely wander throughout the political spectrum. But I do think that there has to come a point where you're like, so where do you land, right? And Joe Rogan is a good example, because he did the same thing for a while, this kind of freewheeling, who am I going to talk to next? And he's very eclectic in his ideas. But over time, he's become a pretty straightforward right-wing guy. Most of the people he talks to are right-wing. Most of the talking points he brings up, if not all of them, are right-wing talking points. He consistently upholds the right-wing narrative on an enormous platform. And so, despite the fact that it's unfortunate that a guy like Joe Rogan has become such a staunch right-winger, it's also kind of helpful in the sense where it's like, at least you're right there and we know where you're at, and you can keep playing this game like, oh, I'm in the middle, I'm straight down the middle. But you're not. It's very clear that you're right-wing because of the types of perspectives that you've chosen to favor. And I think we'll probably see the same thing from Theo Von at some point. I mean, eventually, after he's talked to everybody, he's going to like decide that he feels one way or the other, or be more on one side of the spectrum than the other. And more of the people he talks to are going to be like that, which I would say already is kind of leaning in the right direction. And that's right-wing direction, and that's the most likely place for him to end up, is just on the right. That's kind of where he started from. And despite the fact that he seems curious about left-wing ideas, and he seems to have openness to a sort of left-wing perspective, he also, that there's a stubbornness that I can tell, despite the fact that he's open-minded, he's probably going to end up back in the same position. Usually more so than it seems like he's wrestling with the truth of these left-wing ideas. It seems more like he's trying to find the reason he disagrees with it. That's my perspective on it. But real quick, I've already talked for a while, but I'm going to play a couple clips from this episode that they did together and just briefly talk about it, because I think these two guys are an interesting example of sort of where we are politically, and this conversation might reflect something broader. I think it at least is an excuse to talk about like, how are we going to handle these types of conversations going forward, who's worth talking to and who's not, and how can we pick up on that. So here's a couple clips from this podcast.
Yeah. So that what you were describing right there is basically the heart of, I wouldn't say the problem necessarily, but that is why a lot of people just like tune out, because they feel just powerless at the end of the day. You got your protests, you vote, and then these guys do whatever the fuck they want to do. What am I supposed to do is like the attitude that the average citizen has in this country. And that's why things slowly but surely seemingly get worse year over year. Maybe not for you and I, because we're relatively successful, but for like average people, for everyday people, shit is fucked up. And they recognize it, but they don't know who is responsible for it. And they become so malleable and so open to responding to anybody that will look at anybody that will recognize their frustration and say it's actually because of this and that. And I think Trump tapped into that so perfectly, and that's why he won. That's why he defeated the Democrats so handily, because he was like, yes, you're angry, I'm angry too. Why are you angry? Because woke libtards, because DEI, because trans people, because undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants aren't your fucking landlord. They're not the one who's raising the price of rent. They don't own the mega corporations. They're not sitting at the board of BlackRock. You know what I mean? It's not a Guatemalan migrant that's sitting at the board of BlackRock, purchasing all the fucking houses. Or they're not the real estate developers that refuse to, add to the like much needed supply of housing.
Yeah, and instead put a fucking rag and bone in every town, dude.
I fucking hate rag and bone.
Well, it's just like, dude, don't tear down cool areas and just put up a rag and bone, dude.
Yeah.
It's not fucking cool. But no, man, it's interesting. I never really heard it put like that. Like, and then of course, the other things, you say these other things to people, that doesn't feel, you gotta point, you have to approach people with something they can point a finger at, and it's whatever they're pointing at is close enough where they feel like it has to tip towards an actual revolution where people pick up. And I don't know if we can say this or not, but
I say it all the time. People call me radical for that.
Really? Oh, I'm a big revolution guy. I've always had little dreams of like or semi-revolutions or like regional or whatever at least. I hope at least I can make it to the regional revolution. Like, I understand if I don't make it to the national one, but I want to be on a horseback or at least on a fucking standing next to a
So a couple interesting things happening here. First of all, we see Theo is taking this kind of revolutionary angle, right? He thinks some kind of revolution should happen. And that is, I think, very much reflective of a lot of people in America's political position. Not just that they want a revolution to happen, but there's a very, very vague idea of like what that's about, what that's over. You do have the dimmest sense of class consciousness amongst a lot of Americans, and this idea that it's the rich versus the poor. And you get that sense from Theo, probably because he grew up amongst that. And so that sense of a desire for revolution is there. But the problem is, if you don't attach that to any type of left-wing politic at all, then what type of revolution do you really have? And I get why people would want to say, well, someone like Theo Von doesn't want to consider himself a leftist or on the left or left wing. And that is an obstacle in America, is like a lot of the people who actually agree with us on most things and might want some kind of revolution against the rich, they are allergic to the idea of socialism. And that is something that I have run into a couple times, and I think it's an interesting dynamic, and it's something we have to remind ourselves about on the left as people who, whether we believe in socialism or like a more democratic socialist vision or something further than that or something different than that, whatever, even our willingness to entertain the word socialism separates us from a lot of other people in America. And while a guy like Bernie Sanders made a huge dent in that by being able to run as a democratic socialist and getting as far as he did, a lot of time has passed since that. And the whole democratic socialist thing and unabashedly identifying himself that way was not so much his tone in 2020 and since then. Not to say he's not still a democratic socialist, but he doesn't quite lead with that anymore. And probably because the insane right-wingers are the ones in power now. So that's when it starts to become really like actually dangerous to call yourself a socialist. Not so much just that you might lose an election, but like, you know, the feds might come after you or something. So I think Theo wrestling with this idea of revolution is good, but there's a serious question about like, can this energy be directed in the right direction? It's tempting to see that energy and say this is not just in Theo Von, but this is Theo Von speaking for his audience and people that he's known in his life to a desire for socialist revolution. Even if he doesn't see it that way or embrace socialism, that's what he's speaking to there. And there's opportunity for that. But the fact that someone like him and the people listening to him have no interest in embracing socialism, or to them what that word means is akin to evil, or at least something that hints at evil, that's a real problem. And so I respect Hasan for going on this platform and trying to have this conversation with him. Hasan has done a few interviews like this lately. Another person that he talked to was Sean O'Brien from the Teamsters, the president of the Teamsters Union. And that was an interesting conversation. Sean O'Brien is also a little bit right-leaning. And there were a couple moments where you could see that Hasan was a little bit uncomfortable talking to this guy because they mostly agree, sort of. Although Sean O'Brien was the one who didn't want to endorse Kamala Harris. I think he endorsed Trump, which was a weird move for a union leader to do. So this guy's kind of questionable. He doesn't seem the brightest, I'll be perfectly honest. He said something to Hasan. He said, oh yeah, the media's got, there's a, what'd he say? He said, there's a pandemic, all right. I'll tell you what it is. The media's got a pandemic. It's called liabetes. And that was a real awkward moment from Hasan because it's a funny thing to say. And I don't know. It just shows that the guy's not the brightest. But I respect that Hasan is talking to people like this who are open-minded, and we need them. You know what I mean? Like, to whatever extent we can win over people like that, we need to. And that's the biggest problem in America, is that the so-called tough guys, or the people who have like a lot of men in their audience, like Theo Von or Joe Rogan, they're completely sold on the idea that socialism is like not masculine, or left-wing politics is not masculine, and it's not it's not an honest form of politics or whatever. And in other countries where that impression doesn't exist so much, socialist movements are able to be a little bit more powerful because they have more brute force behind them. You see this with the MAGA movement. If the MAGA movement was a bunch of teenagers and, weaklings, then they wouldn't be as threatening as they are, given the fact that there's a lot of grown men and fairly large humans that consider themselves MAGA and are willing to go out in the streets about it. And on the socialist left-wing side, that's what we lack in America. And it's not to say that, different types of people can't contribute to that same use of brute force. Of course they can. But I'm just saying the more big, beefy motherfuckers we have, the better. And we don't have enough right now. So, I think the other interesting thing that Theo Von said here was he said when Hasan was talking about how people's anger gets misdirected by anybody who will look at them, essentially. Anybody who will acknowledge their anger and pretend to provide a solution can win over these giant portions of the electorate, because nobody's speaking to those people. And even when Kamala Harris is trying to speak to those people, or another politician is trying to, the language she's using, the way she's going about it, does not break from that impression that people have of politicians as being phony. And one thing about Trump, despite the fact that he's a liar and, he's about as crooked as a politician could be, the way he speaks cuts through that so that people feel like he's talking directly to them. And when introduced to this idea, Theo Von kind of says, I never heard somebody put it like that. And that's interesting because we are very familiar with this idea, because we've been explaining to ourselves and to others why people who should be more into left-wing politics support Donald Trump, why people who hate the rich support Donald Trump. And we know that it's because their honest anger and working class disenfranchisement is targeted in the wrong direction. And but a guy like Theo Von has never thought about that. So that's the value of having a conversation with him, and hopefully some of his audience can also have some of those topics broken open in their mind a little bit, because I'm not a big debate guy. I'm not big on going and watching people debate. Sam Cedar is apparently going to be on that Jubilee show where they have 20 people arguing with one person. That's going to be great. But aside from that, I don't know. I'm just not that. I used to watch debates. I don't really anymore. I don't know how helpful it is. But I think there is something to be said for the fact that you can reach people who have genuinely never heard someone put things this way. And in some cases, that might be enough to change some minds. And it's just something to think about going forward. That the other thing that helps Hasan is that he knows these arguments in and out. He knows the arguments of right-wingers. He knows how to counteract them. So when you're talking to somebody who might employ some of those talking points, but is also just more of an honest person who's just kind of talking things through, talking to somebody who knows these issues in and out is better in order to like cut through those talking points and get to something that is a little bit more universal. And the benefit, the advantage that we have as people on the left is that the concerns we speak to are universal. They are absolutely universal. And when Theo Von talks about how he would like there to be a revolution, he is hinting at this universal struggle that we're all aware of. And all we lack in America is the ability to put that into clear enough terms that the maximum amount of people are on board with it. So that's the project that we need to be focused on. And Hasan Piker, he's not a perfect commentator. He's not a perfect interviewer. He's not a perfect interviewee. But I think he's doing a good job of getting in there and simplifying these things in a way that can crack through to some people that have never heard it put a certain way before. So Hasan is helpful. Maybe, there need to be other people doing it than him. But for someone who is as far to the left as him to be able to communicate as clearly as he does is something that I think benefits us all a lot. And we need to all think about in terms of it's not pleasant to debate and argue with some of these people, but being able to identify someone who has genuine curiosity and feeding that curiosity with good and better information and better solutions could go a long way in terms of influencing the conversation. Because eventually people are going to realize these right-wing solutions that we're seeing are not going to work. They're making things worse. And right now people don't see that because Donald Trump is just getting in there. Elon Musk is just getting in there. So there's still an excitement in the air about it. But that's going to fade away, and people are going to realize that things were taken from them and wealth was transferred upward. And Donald Trump lied about a lot of things. And some people are never going to be convinced to that effect. But there are people out there who are going to be looking for answers when that happens, and we've got to be ready. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And if you really want to support, consider becoming a member. That's the best way to support me. I'll be posting all kinds of stuff there, exclusive podcasts, songs, beats. If you like the beats that play in the back of this podcast, all that's going to be posted there, and other stuff. If there's stuff you'd like to see as exclusive content, just let me know and we'll figure some things out.